Live stream. Welcome everyone to the Beckys Anonymous live stream. My name is Lee and I get to be your facilitator tonight. With us today we have Nicole and Ayesha, who both have been guests with us before on the live stream, so you may recognize their faces. And Alexia, who's another founding member of Beckys Anonymous. And I'm sure what's on everybody's mind is the election, which we're going to talk a lot about today. But what we really want to focus on today is the day after the election. And just to help remind all of us that it ain't over, folks. Whatever happens on election day, regardless if Trump wins, Biden wins, Trump tries to steal the election, the real work really begins that day after. And so even though we are all still continuing to do our preparation for the election and do our voting actions, I want to remind everyone that we do have a voting toolkit on all of our social media, at Beckys Anonymous. Please check it out. It can help you think about how to spend these last days before the election. But right now, we want to transition to thinking about the day after. And we're going to play out some of those scenarios that I mentioned and hear from our panelists today about how we can show up in those different scenarios. And so I'd love to start with Ayesha Wilson. Ayesha, you're on the school committee in Cambridge. You are on the board of directors of the YWCA, secretary of the NAACP. You work as a social worker with some of the most vulnerable populations in Massachusetts. Would love to hear from you. What is really at stake for our vulnerable communities that will be most impacted if Trump wins the election? So please share with us your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you to Beckys Anonymous for hosting this panel. I think this is such an important conversation to be having and really thinking about that preparation for the day after. What I want to also do is just take a step back to the day after the 2016 election and what that looked like and the impact that actually had on the young people that I service. We are in a very beautiful city of Cambridge, and in Cambridge, there was a lot of racism, a lot of racist acts that my young people had experienced the day after. Many of my Muslim students, the wearing of their hijabs were very, they experienced a lot of negative attention just by going into the local neighboring markets for lunch during that school day. The comments that they received were heart-wrenching, and just thinking about people being negative to them, go back to your country, you don't belong here, other rude things like now that we won, too bad for you ends and all this stuff. And for my young people to come into my space and share that with me, the emotional turmoil that I saw in them was hard to experience. And so as we think about and maybe even brace ourselves for what this election can bring, and if Trump is then reelected, how do we hold our mental health and well-being sacred and intact, knowing that this could, that we can all experience this very differently? And how do we show up for our young people? How do we show up for our most vulnerable population? So I just want to think about, how do we show up in being empathetic? How do we show compassion? How do we show even our own true feelings and emotions of hurt and pain and disappointment, if that is the case? But I do want to say that I'm very hopeful, and I'm very, I'm extremely hopeful that this will go in favor of the people and what we actually need and what we deserve for our country to really move forward. We have had, almost 4 years of a flipped society, and a society that has been so underwelcoming and so, insulting in so many areas. I mean, I have family across the world, and they're looking at America and looking at us as the laughingstock. And so how do we sit with that, and knowing that we need to still move things forward. And so as a local policymaker, you know, my job as a school committee member is to shape the policies here within our school districts and make sure that, you know, regardless of what's happening on the national level and the federal government, that we're able to create change here, even if it doesn't see eye to eye to what the federal government would like to see. So that's my goal. That's what I'm working towards. I'm really supporting my young people to, how do they shape their anger? If it is anger that is produced, how do we turn that anger into action? And what does that action then look like for the next 4 years? And that's kind of, I'll leave it there and pause there for a moment. But I really think that if it is true that Trump is that winner, that we really need to think about the action steps that we put in play for the next 4 years.
Thank you, Ayesha. And that brings, I think what you really helped highlight is both how do we be prepared to hold the optimism until that moment, and then that switch for a lot of us and the people around of us may switch very quickly to other emotions. And how do we make sure that, I think you mentioned, particularly as a leader in your community, how are you setting an example of what we do with those feelings, and providing those structures and that guidance for exactly as you said, action. And I also appreciated you still saying the word optimism, and I think that really helps us move to our next panelist, Nicole Fonsh, who first, you know, as a progressive grassroots organizer with showing up for racial justice, I first just want to say thank you so much for your contributions to the voting toolkit. I think when Ayesha talks about that optimism, it's because of organizations and people like you who have put in the work to say, let's be a part of making sure things go a different way this election. And a part of that is thinking about how do we help not let everything that you've built end if Biden wins. How do we not let people say, oh, Biden won, okay, I'm going to go home. And we've seen that over and over again. We saw that after Obama, where that whole momentum really kind of fizzled out. It felt like we've seen that with sort of the mobilization of the pussy hats and that dwindling. We see that recently with reports of sort of dwindling support or attention to Black Lives Matter. So as someone who I also know is really active in getting Biden elected, but also really acknowledges how much we're going to have to keep Biden and Harris accountable the day after. We'd love to hear from you. How can we show up in the same ways we have been, even if Biden wins? How is the work not over?
Sure. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Beckys Anonymous, for having me back. And really appreciate, Ayesha, your words as well of hope and optimism, despite kind of what happens. Yes, I have been doing a lot of work to kind of ensure Biden victory, but that's a little bit of a break from what I do and feel is so important. And that's really our local communities and our local policy. Ayesha spoke to this a little bit as well. Like, no matter what happens, that's what it comes down to. It's holding all of our politicians accountable, kind of no matter what happens. I'm so hopeful that Biden and Harris will win. We still have politicians in Massachusetts that we need to hold accountable for many things going on right now. I know Alexia will speak to some of those. And even if Biden wins, Trump over the last 4 years, and with help from administrations before him, I'm not going to put everything on the last 4 years, he's stolen Supreme Court seats, and that is going to have a huge impact on our country and on our most vulnerable, no matter who wins. And so I've done a lot of work in kind of the reproductive justice movements, and I think those will continue to be so important no matter what happens. Bodily autonomy is is it. If people don't have the right to make choices about their bodies, then literally none of us are free. I mean, that's just how it is. And so there are things that we can be doing down ballot in our own states to make sure that those access to healthcare, access to abortion, which is healthcare, which is a human right, continue for everyone. In Massachusetts right now, for over a year now, been trying to get the Roe Act passed, which would make sure that no matter what happens on a federal level to Roe v. Wade, we would have protections in Massachusetts for abortion. New York State did something similar after Kavanaugh was put on the Supreme Court. I mean, right, because it's those moments when people realize, oh, right, there is a real chance here that we can lose the right to abortion. There's been also over like 300 restrictions put on abortion since probably the last 10 years or so, right? And so, depending on what state you are in, those restrictions can basically make it impossible for you to get an abortion. So I think that's one kind of specific policy issue, but it's so big and it drives so much. And so I think that there are other issues like that people can focus on in their own communities, no matter what happens. The importance of mutual aid funds that have come up from this remind me a lot of the work that abortion funds have been doing for years. And I'm so grateful for the mutual aid funds that have been doing so much. And I think they'll continue to be so important, even if Biden wins. And I feel the same with abortion funds and independent abortion clinics and kind of that whole world out there, because people can't make choices about their body and when to have a child, no matter who is the president of the United States. That is a problem. So I could rant about that forever, but I think those are the things, right? Like, it's not Biden winning will be so important, especially to the pandemic and what is happening, and maybe having some healing of sorts. But I think that happens in our communities. And I think we have to hold all of our politicians accountable, and each other. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. I think it helps remind us that Trump, is the crescendo of a wave that's been happening for a long time. He's the tip of the iceberg. And so again, even with the Biden win, there is so much work. There's we're starting from a million steps behind, especially when you talk about certain issues. So it's a great reminder to help keep that momentum, and again, to really help remind us what's at stake. But I think equally what's at stake to help motivate us to do the work. And how do we really plug in with the work? So thank you, Nicole, and thank you for adding to the list of things list of things and people we need to be thinking about this election and the day after. So now I want to hear from Alexia. Alexia, you've been involved in social justice organizing, solidarity work that includes racial justice organizing in the Boston area and in the world for decades. And as someone who identifies as a white woman who identifies as a Beckys Anonymous, want to hear from your experience. What are the things that white women need to be thinking about in this moment? We heard how oftentimes there's that instinct to do, and in Beckys Anonymous, we're really trying to take that pause to really make sure that do is intentional, that do has the impact that we want. So want to hear, both from, all of your years of experience in showing up in that way. This is not new to you as far as showing up in that way, but how do we need to think specifically as white women in this moment? And based on what we heard from Alexia and Nicole today, how do we think about showing up this next day, the day after the election, and particularly when we think about if Trump steals the election? Mm-hmm. That's on a lot of people's minds. Yeah. I think a lot of people are a little bit like, wait, can that really happen? What do I really do if that happens? I think to the point that Alexia brought up about emotions in that moment, I think Ayesha brought up about emotions. I think that will trigger a lot of emotions if that happens, that we need to be prepared about. So want to hear from you, Alexia, your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for mentioning your segue was going to be my segue. Ayesha, what you said about showing true feelings and emotion, specifically in front of our young people, so that we can model that is something that we want them to be able to do. Before talking about ways to get engaged and get plugged in, I think that it's really important that we recognize that very much a part of white culture is wanting to do, and what is the fix? Give me the list. Let me check a box. And part of what we lose by buying into white supremacy and whiteness is feeling an emotion that is connected to community. Any feeling that's beyond the damsel in distress as a white woman. And so I just want to name that it's okay to feel the immensity of what is happening right now, and all around us. It's okay to feel rage and sorrow and grief and hurt, and to be energized by those things, and maybe then to do. But jumping into the do without recognizing oneself is problematic on a lot of levels, and one of them is that you show up false, so and inauthentically. So I just wanted to kind of preface with that in the whatever happens, it will be intense, and it will probably not end on November 3rd. And so for us, especially those of us who identify as white, it's okay to feel these things, and to kind of push off the jump into action, not forever, but for take a breath. So the things that I want to focus on are largely about working with BIPOC, which is a term that's popping up more these days, but it stands so that we're all on the same page. It stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, really putting at the forefront of even how we name marginalized communities and speak about marginalized communities, those who are most oppressed. So when in the days after, what we really want to do, specifically speaking, white woman to white women as much as possible, is to work with BIPOC organizing that's happening in your area. All of us are in the greater Boston area, so a lot of what we talk about is very, very Boston and Massachusetts centric, but you can find similar organizing bodies almost all over the country. In Boston, we're looking at Black Lives Matter Boston and Violence in Boston are two groups that are taking a lot of leadership here. Join their mailing lists, follow them on social media. When they ask for white folks to show up, show up. Similarly, more at the national scale, connecting with national movements like Stopping the Coup, which is something that has surfaced recently, that is literally a guidebook about what we need to do if Trump refuses to leave office. If Biden is elected and Trump refuses to leave office. We have not seen the likes of that in this country, although we have been responsible for it in a number of other countries. This will be the first time, hope, God willing not, but this could be the first time that we see something like that on our soil. Stopping the Coup is a step-by-step guidebook about how to mobilize and organize folks in your area, and how to kind of stand at the ready, because we need to be prepared for the full range of what could happen in the wake of the election, all the way from worst case scenario of armed militias in the street to something that seems a lot more safe, like holding our elected officials accountable, which is still hard for some people to do, to step up and do that. And then the other thing that I would really mention is for white women and white people being willing to use the privilege and protection afforded to white women to protect the safety of others. And how Nicole mentioned stuff that's down ballot politics that are local, where you might see an impact that is day to day rather than policy that takes a little while to trickle down to your day to day life. A good example is, or good, bad example, depending on how you want to look at it. Massachusetts had one of the strongest eviction moratoriums in the country, and it expired this weekend on Saturday. And there was a ton of local organizing trying to keep it, to extend the moratorium because the COVID pandemic is far from over. And as Ayesha spoke about on the first live stream she was a part of, that the way COVID has impacted our communities is that the impact is far greater in communities of color. And if you look at that and you look at an urban area like Boston where poverty is racialized, and we can make the assumption that many of these evictions will be people of color. Just, numbers wise, math wise. And especially in a state and a city where there is such huge wealth disparities. Most recent statistics saying that a white family has wealth of upwards of $250,000 and Black families in the city of Boston have wealth upwards of $8. And so think about the protections that are afforded you as a white woman and enact those protections. Organizations like City Life Vida Urbana and Right to the City are mobilizing folks to be ready for eviction blockades. They're training tenants in how to stand up against eviction. What are your rights if you are presented with eviction? And so just really plug in, work with, and follow the leadership of those who are most marginalized in your area, and leaning a little bit further into racialized capitalism, which is what we're experiencing here. Beckys Anonymous, as part of our work, has launched a reparations fund. And what our aim is to collect money from white people and put it in the hands of Black folks who run the reparations circle. It is not our decision where the money goes, but capitalism is a pillar of white supremacy, beginning and end. And any reparative actions that we can take, be they big or small, make a difference, and they model how larger institutions can do them. That's it.
Thank you, Alexia. So I wanted to call out just the wide range of what's going to be called for us to show up on that day. You greatly articulated the wide range of how do we feel what we're feeling on that day? How do we do what's required and show up physically? I heard particularly this emphasis on how do we not just show up with our voices and our minds, but what is required in this moment. I appreciate you also reminding us that the reality of a coup, and to use that word, and reminding us of the history of the U.S. The U.S. is familiar with coups. Yes, we've never had one here, but that's what that would be if he refuses, and how we can really mark to many comments that have already been made that make this much more than just a conspiracy theory. He's made it very clear that he has those intentions. So appreciate that. And thank you for just giving shout out particularly to people who are interested in getting more involved, particularly through Beckys Anonymous. Just what are some of the ways that we're creating action steps around this. I also wanted to just particularly plug and reinforce what all three of you have said, is to remind us that this election is not just about whether Trump wins, to learn what else is on your ballot, learn what other candidates and what's going on. So just wanted to highlight that. I particularly am tempted to say, particularly white people who've ever said anything about methadone mile or complained about all the homeless people already in Massachusetts, which had already the most increase in the country most recently. You want to be concerned about this moratorium, and how are you showing up then to help mobilize this impact. So wanted to just now give Ayesha and Nicole a chance to share any reactions to the other scenarios that kind of preempted my questions with specific scenarios. Ayesha, wanted to maybe start with you if you had reactions as we were hearing about those other scenarios, anything that came up for you, and then Nicole, anything else that you wanted to share as you heard other people.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. I think, what's really coming up for me is just, again, how do we show up, right? How do we show up not only for each other, but how do we use our privilege for good? How do we really engage in that good trouble from now until election day and then even after? So, how do you sign up and volunteer for your local phone banks that you can actually get involved with and make sure that you're turning out the vote in other cities and states that are maybe swing left states, right? I myself have participated in, Cambridge for Biden-Harris phone banking campaigns. And, I've called to Virginia, I've called to Texas, and I plan to continue to engage. Make sure that you vote early. Make sure that you're talking to your friends and neighbors across the city, across the country to actually show up and vote. What is their plan? Making sure that individuals have an actual plan to actually vote is critically important during this time. And then when we are preparing for what the days are afterwards, we know that the work still does not end, right? We know that there's still work to be continued. And then, as Nicole and Alexia both articulated, how do you push on your local policymakers to make sure that they are doing the work for you at the local level? Because although the federal state government is critically important in how we actually move things, what's really moving things in your local cities is your local government, like your local politicians. And so myself as a school committee member, I don't take that privilege lightly. It's very important for me to stay involved and be completely engaged with my constituents to make sure that I am showing up and raising their voices as best I can. And my population, my kids, my students, they're my heart. So I see them as being closest to the pain, right? And we've heard from Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who said those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And so I tune into them and utilize their voices for good in terms of impacting whatever policies or motions I put in place. It's always going to be youth-centered first. And then I'm thinking about the greater society, whether that's the educators, families, and all of that, and, families of color, educators of color, and how are we looking more at the marginalized communities within a community? And that's critically important as well. So, the work is definitely not going to stop. We must continue regardless of who is elected into office. But we do know that, especially, again, in our greater city of Cambridge and Boston, greater Boston, how do we show up as neighbors and be neighborly to each other, regardless of what the outcome is? And that's going to be important. And how do we, again, regardless of what the decision is, not use that opportunity to be violent, not use that opportunity to be harmful to anybody, because we're all going through we will be going through a variety of emotions, and we all have to kind of sit there and be present in that space, but also understand that there's a bigger picture that we need to tackle as well. So I think I think that's that.
Awesome, Ayesha. Thank you so much, and appreciate you helping remind us of what are the communities that we want to be in solidarity with, and whose spirit are we holding in those days after. Want to just, Nicole, any other last thoughts for people in these last days before the election? Again, just want to plug the great voting toolkit that you helped us put together with 12 steps that all of you out there can take before the election. But any other last thoughts on things that people should be thinking about or doing?
Yeah, I mean, Ayesha said it all so well and included so many things there. I don't have anything really to add, just that getting involved in anything in your community, it makes, like, selfishly, it makes you feel better too. And I don't mean that in like a charity white savior type of thing, more that it's how you keep hope. And if you don't, like, that's the design, right? Like, they don't want you to have hope. And so building community with others and doing the work with others gives you a groundwork for that. It gives you, it gives you hope. And it kind of gets you through the bad times too. Because it's up and down, right? It's not like a totally up and whatever. So yeah, that's my, just, find something, Lexi gave so many wonderful organizations too, like, find one of those and do the work with others. And I swear you will still do the doom scrolling that I do, but you will then have time with people in community, kind of making things better. And that helps.
Thank you, Nicole. And I think that what Beckys Anonymous came from is particularly that call from BIPOC leaders saying, it's not just you need to organize and be neighborly, it's white people need to talk to other white people about how you're going to really be a part of ending this. And that until, you all decide to get on the same page and ending this, this is going to be a long struggle. So want to just end with hearing, Alexia, if you could just share with our audience, particularly those who are wanting to get more involved with Beckys Anonymous, what are maybe some also last concrete actions? We have some things in addition to the voting toolkit that would be great for our Beckys Anonymous viewers to hear about. So.
Thank you. So check out our toolkit. We are pulling together a lunch meeting the day after the election, November 4th at noon. It's an open circle for anyone who wants to process what has happened, is happening, will continue to happen with the election. I have to continue to plug the reparations circle because I also have to continue to underline that white supremacy is upheld by capitalism, and transfer of wealth is one of the ways in which we can take legitimate, tangible action and model for institutions like our government that say this is not possible, we can't do it. Well, look at us, we're doing it even at a small scale. So check out the voter toolkit, join the give to the reparations fund or other local organizations who are doing this kind of work. If this is not necessarily before the election, but to continue beyond the election, because as we've named, fighting white supremacy is about more than electoral politics. We've just given us a focus in this time because this election is so important. We have monthly introduction circles for white women that want to join the Beckys Anonymous circle to do the internal work that it takes to be ready to show up, to push off, because we kind of say, we're in recovery from white supremacy. This is something that's been taught to us. We're addicted to it, and we need to release it and recover from it. So joining an intro circle, check out the voter toolkit, give to the reparations fund, and day after November 4th, join us for Circle if you're available. Is there anything else, Lee? Is that it?
That was it. That's enough. Yep, it's all great stuff. So we really hope to see more viewers join us in the future. And thank you for those of you who joined us live. Those of you who are watching this again, shout out to you all as well. I just want to thank Nicole, Ayesha, and Alexia. Thanks so much for your time tonight and your great thoughts. And look forward to continuing this work with you all. So thank you, and great evening to all of you and everyone out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Thank
Thanks, ladies.
you. Bye.